You're watching Bloomberg Quint, and the editorial team here is focusing on the rural economy. Lots has been said over the course of 2017 about stress in the farm sector. We're trying to understand whether that's something that the government needs to focus on and whether something can be done via the budget as well. But before we get into a discussion, let me just set up the stage for you. What's been going on in the rural economy? And the rural economy, remember, should not be equated simply to the agricultural economy. But on the agricultural economy, the advanced GDP estimates that we got for FY18 in some ways pinpointed what the problem is. If you look at both the nominal and the real GVA growth numbers for the agricultural sector, the real GVA growth is expected to be 2.1%, well below last year's 4.9%. But perhaps the bigger indicator of stress that could be building up in the agricultural sector is the 2.8% nominal GVA growth, which tells you that lower prices and lower output is perhaps putting stress on the farm sector. A large part of this has been what's happening to agricultural prices. So if you look at the WPI number for the food segment, you have seen a fair amount of volatility, with prices being as low as 0.29% at the start of 2017, dipping to negative territory by the middle of the year and now climbing to about 6%. This is the year-on-year growth in wholesale price inflation. But we've seen a number of items see negative inflation as well, or deflation. Pulses in particular comes to mind. The other conversation that happens in the context of the farm sector is what's been happening to wage growth. And a lot of people have pointed out that wage growth has been weak. It has been weak. There was a slight pickup and then another decline that you've seen in the latest numbers. But if you look at it over a period of time, you can see that wage growth levels have come off quite substantially from the 2010-2011 period. And perhaps that's another point to focus on in terms of what could be sparking off distress in the agricultural economy. But not everything points to distress, because there are conflicting indicators. Take, for instance, tractor sales. And this could probably draw the link between the agricultural sector and the broader rural economy, which is not entirely dependent on agriculture anymore. Tractor sales are expected to hit a record high this year. ICRA projects the growth in tractor sales at about 12 to 13% and a CAGR of about 8 to 9% over a longer term period. And Nielsen gave a comment to Bloomberg Quint suggesting that the subdued sales in the FMCG sector have reversed, and the later part of 2017 saw nearly double-digit growth in the FMCG sector, which draws a lot of its sales from rural demand. So we are trying to understand what is the problem, where does it lie, and where do the correctives lie? Joining us here to talk about some of this is Abhijit Sen, former member of the Planning Commission, and Mr. S. Sivakumar, Agri Division Head at ITC. So we are hoping to get an economist perspective, but also a perspective from the corporate end. Thank you both very much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time. Mr. Sivakumar, can you first help us give us your sense actually as to where the problem lies? Has it been a problem that has come up in the last 1 year? Could it be linked to pressures that emerged after demonetization? Or is it a longer 3-4 year story which is now starting to come to the fore?
No, this year is somewhat different from the prior 2 years. You already talked about low prices. I think that is the fundamental reason for pressure in the current year. The prior 2 years were somewhat relatively lower production, but better prices. And I think as part of controlling food inflation, whatever got initiated, I think led to some of these lower prices. And because the monsoon was good, crops were better, and there was some excess planting also in crops which saw higher prices in the previous year. So consequently, you had a situation of oversupply, and that led to a drop in prices. And there was not so much of export demand also, because rupee appreciated, and in some commodities, because of erratic rainfall here and there, there was some crop quality issues also. So I think the prices remaining low is what the year would be known for, more than anything else as far as agriculture is concerned.
Let me put that question to Dr. Sen as well. Dr. Sen, say the last 1 year when we've at least started to hear a lot more about stress in the agriculture sector, are you in agreement with Mr. Sivakumar that the core problem has been price levels?
Yes, the last 1 year certainly has been the price level. Output has rebounded. The previous 2 years were bad on the output side. Prices were okay. But taken together, you've got 3 years, 2 bad on the output side and 1 disastrous on the prices side, while being good on output.
Dr. Sen?
Now 2017-18 is... Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please complete your thoughts, sir.
Yeah, 2017-18 has just, harvest has only started coming in October. So I think a lot of that is still up in the air. I believe that the GDP, the GVA figures from agriculture that you referred to for 2017-18 might be somewhat underestimates. They are based on the first advanced estimates. They tend to be lower than what it finally actually is. We certainly know that on certain crops like cotton, it's going to be much better than those estimates say they are. Nonetheless, I think really what the year which has started already, that is the 2017-18 crop, coming in from October, and then the Rabi will come in, April onwards. I think that's the one to really look at, because prices are still fairly low. Area sown figures for Rabi don't look particularly good, except for pulses. And the Kharif figures, although they're likely to be better than what the advanced estimate puts it, are far too low compared to what we know happened in the monsoon. Despite a few aberrations, the monsoon was fairly good. So as far as agricultural production goes, I'm a bit disappointed. Given 2 good monsoons in a row, I would have expected a much better year this year. But the rural situation this year, quite apart from the fact there's not output so much as it is prices, as Sivakumar pointed out, it's also something else. It's construction continues to be down. And that has an immense amount of impact. And that has an impact upon wages, and a lot of agricultural families now get their incomes from other things. Agriculture makes up less than half of rural incomes. And all of that actually adds up to what the rural situation is. And I think there, the construction as well as the MSME sectors are possibly equally important as agriculture, if not more, for things like FMCG demand.
Let me put that question to Mr. Sivakumar. Mr. Sivakumar, is that what you hear from your folks on the ground, that the problem may be coming in from other areas as well? But the rural demand indicators from a corporate perspective have been very confusing. Tractor sales have been, for instance, very, very strong. FMCG numbers were down, but we've seen companies indicate to better times ahead. Can you give us a clearer sense of what's happening in terms of rural demand, which then brings together agriculture and some of these other ancillary activities that the rural sector is dependent on?
Yeah, so while on aggregate there is a pressure, but I think part of this agricultural distress on account of low prices is partly made up by some cash flows out of the government spends. One is of course construction. Although Professor Sen said there is some level of down, I think some states the movement for rural housing on account of government fund flows has been better, which compensated these lower prices in terms of certainly cash flow and some wage labor. We also saw NREGA funds being allowed for spending on farm ponds and some agricultural activities in asset building. So that also gave some more wages and cash flows. And loan waivers in a few states brought in some more cash and fresh borrowings from the bank. And of course, the overall credit flow continued to stay up. So I think some of these cash flows, notwithstanding lower prices, if we saw then some level of growth being projected is on account of these things. And obviously these cash flows also meant keeping up some demand improvement from an FMCG perspective. And the tractors demand is more arising out of previous years' higher prices and the whatever loan waivers happen in somewhat an early stage. I think some of that was deployed in tractors, not so much because wages were becoming higher, but I think partly because availability of labor at the peak time for the farmers' requirements. Keeping that in mind, farmers have invested the prior year's higher incomes also into tractors. So I think some of these other elements, if they were also not there, obviously we would have seen a deeper distress. But I think some of that spends from the government have actually made up the situation, and that's how we are receiving some positive signals from pockets. I mean, obviously, all India is just not one situation. There are different pockets where rainfall was good and bad. There are different pockets where loan waivers happened and otherwise. There are different pockets where construction is occurring. And so as a result, you will see that mixed. And when you aggregate, the net bottom is because of the other spends.
Mr. Sivakumar, good morning. This is Menaka here. I think the question to try and move this forward, given that we are facing a budget and hopefully some new policy prescriptions towards this, if anything, for the short to medium term, do you expect this situation of agri/rural distress to sustain over the next 6 months to 1 year? Do you believe there are factors that could alleviate it, besides policy decisions? Or do you think that the only thing that will help at this point in time is some kind of urgent rescue measure?
So, two sets of issues. I think one level of urgent rescue measure has been done in the last month and 2 months in terms of raising import duties on wheat, on pulses, in some of these areas, edible oils. I think although it has not yet had any significant impact on improving prices, but certainly this would mean literally no imports as far as wheat is concerned, and particular pulses where duties have been raised, and some imports of course will continue in vegetable oils even at these kind of rates. So that is one corrective step, although we are yet to see any significant kind of result. I think what we need to really look at the situation as prices would have fallen further but for these import duty increases. But I think there's something more fundamental that needs to be corrected if this situation we don't see every few years is in reforming the agricultural marketing regulation. We already seen a new model act in 2017, which has incorporated critical features like ensuring that the regulator duty is segregated from the operator, as in Mandi Board was playing both the roles earlier. So we need to move it forward by states actually adopting this law and ensure that multiple marketing options exist for the farmer in a manner that reaches out to the consumer in a value-added form. I think that reform needs to be translated to the ground. That becomes a key agenda point. So therefore, what would one expect in policy measures or even in budgetary allocations would be to see as to what incentive is provided to states to actually translate this into action. The other area is for the price risk management. Much of these ups and downs in prices happen because the only way farmer plants is by looking at last year's prices. Unless this is seen as a future price and preferably option supported price operating and farmer deciding planting on that basis. So once again a step was taken last year when SEBI has amended and allowed options, and this also again needs to translate onto the ground, that exchanges have to launch the contracts, have to build the capacity to ensure surveillance is right and markets don't get distorted, and then the markets actually translate this onto the ground by offering in their own contracting with the farmers that these options are embedded in. So I think these two important measures have been taken. This needs to get into action. I think that will be quite an important step to ensure that the price levels don't remain so volatile.
Let me put that to Dr. Sen as well. Dr. Sen, on the price levels, very often you'll hear people talk about the MSPs, but a lot of people have pointed out to us that the MSPs may not be the problem. Firstly, over the last 12 or 14 months, do you believe that demonetization played a role in the excess volatility that came into prices? If so, was it a one-time factor? Or do you think larger issues are at play here? As, of course, Mr. Sivakumar was pointing out, reforms, APMC, etc., which we've been talking about for many years now, actually.
Both. I think obviously demonetization must have played some part. But the bigger picture is that agricultural prices have been volatile for donkey's years, and they continue to be volatile. The sort of reforms that Sivakumar talked about have been long overdue. They've been on the board from the early 2000s onwards, since the 2001 onwards. Model bills after model bills have gone out. We now have a government which, is basically has the same party ruling in every state. Chances of something happening now are better than they've been for the period during which there were really different governments in different political parties in different states. So hopefully some of that should go through. Those are long-run reforms which are necessary. And Sivakumar is absolutely right. I mean, it's those long-run reforms, and to that I would add the technology side, except that there, I think there is some lack of will showing at the moment. A lot of ICAR institutes are at the moment headless. But market and technology are the two long-run areas that you should keep focusing on, although these will not give you very short-run results immediately. On the short run, I think again Sivakumar is absolutely right. It is the things which are already ongoing. There are certain government schemes which are good schemes. They're in agriculture, and the ones he mentioned which are not in agricultural proper. For example, rural housing, expanded Narega, all of that. And tied to agriculture to the extent that farm ponds and things. Now, those are again very important, especially if things go wrong. That's the only way government can effectively pump demand into the economy. And let's not forget that the question we began with is what's going to happen in 2018. Now, what's going to happen in 2018 will, like in any other year, will depend a great deal on what happens to the 2018 monsoon. We don't know what is going to happen, and God forbid that it's not a bad monsoon, because if it's a bad monsoon, then you will need some way, and the government will intervene, being with elections around the corner. And the one thing that I think every economist and everyone hopes for, that is not going to be a knee-jerk reaction. There are things on the ground, and the government should play them, and those are the tried and tested things of injecting demand, continuing with long-run policy. Yes, export-import policies do help, not actually going overboard and, banning this or banning that. And one wants to see what happens. I mean, one hopes that this time around we'll have less knee-jerk, more focused, and on things which are already working.
Can I ask you for a brief response to help
if you
assess...
ask me to give a guess about...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, sir, but if I could ask you for a brief response to help assess what you make of the government's MSP or minimum support price policy. It has been critiqued in the last year or two as being fairly rigid in wanting to maintain lower levels. So just curious to know whether you think that there is certain amount of flexibility that the government needs to show in the MSP policy, or whether you believe that what they're doing is right.
I think what they're doing is more or less in line. I mean, obviously MSP covers crops, and we can disagree about this crop or that crop. Maybe it is true that certain crops we had too high an MSP, for certain other crops it was too low. But on the whole, it's a job which is largely done by an expert body. Nobody really messes with that expert body to the extent that it used to be messed with earlier. I would actually, on that, accept what the CACP does and do not quarrel too much with it, but admit that MSPs have a relatively modest role to play in the situation that we are now watching. The import measure, the import tariff measures that Sivakumar talked about, but will probably play a much greater role in the coming months.
Mr. Sivakumar, yesterday speaking to an insurance player and a wealth manager earlier seemed to suggest that a couple of moves that the government has taken have far-reaching long-term benefits, even though they might be smaller in nature compared to others. One of them is DBT. The other one is the crop insurance scheme, which a lot of people have been talking about. But it's questionable as to the kind of response it's making, because the experience of the insurance companies is also that the claims are a bit lumpy. The methodology is not quite well known. You are close to the ground as well. What are your thoughts on both of these?
So I think both are good steps forward. I think building climate resilience of agriculture is very important for India. And one, of course, technology, Professor Sen already talked about in terms of how to improve climate resilience. And the second is reducing that risk through irrigation, where we have seen the irrigation schemes, investments happening, and insurance should something go wrong. So in the insurance part of it, obviously, there is a significantly revised scheme we have seen getting implemented from last year, which is relatively more market-oriented and with subsidies coming in from the government. So we understand subsidies have not flown in from center to state and from state to insurance companies to be able to activate this on the ground as exhaustively as one thought would happen when the scheme was announced. And so hopefully, as we move into the second year, that will get also improved as far as insurance is concerned. I think certainly it is an important measure, because we can never be right on weather, and particularly as we are seeing more variations and extreme variations in micro regions, this is important. DBT, I think there is wherever the pilots have been done, what we hear from the ground is extremely positive. That again needs to be scaled up. This is certainly one way to reduce the quantum of subsidies and get it deployed right. Fertilizer, for example, the amount of urea that is getting deployed on the ground obviously is distorting. And among the various other measures that we already hear that are taking place, DBT is also something which will help there. And so is case with food subsidy, because this issue of farmers wanting higher MSPs and consumers wanting lower prices cannot move on until such time the execution is efficient. And one method to make it efficient again is going to be DBT. So I think these certainly, no doubt, are steps in the right direction. I think we are looking towards improved execution as a route to deliver the results that one hopes from these kind of schemes and initiatives.
Dr. Sen, I have time for one last question, and I'm just going to bring it back to the budget, but also, to the perennial issue of loan waivers. We've seen some states announce those, not clear how effective those have been. The central government has, sort of not shunned these waivers, but not accepted that this is required at this point in time as well. As we get into a budget, would you advise the government to stay away from farm loan waivers? Although there are people who says that there are situations in which, sometimes they're needed if there is a perception that there is a build-up of debt in the rural economy. Your thoughts on, the potential farm loan waiver if it could come in a budget, and anything else that you think the budget should focus on, sir?
No, pretty definite. I mean, government should stay away from loan waivers. But the other day I was speaking at a farmers, I was there at a farmers meeting, and one thing I heard was this. Farmers were saying that everybody talks about loan waivers, writing off bank loans. What happened to the money lenders' loans? And these money lenders have now all put their money back into the banks. The demonetization should have helped on that. Is the government not thinking anything about it? And I thought, hell, that's one aspect of demonetization I hadn't thought of. And while everybody talks of loan waivers, Nobody talks about the waivers that could be managed with the fact that, there is a huge loan amount which comes in the cash economy, and that cash is now supposed to be in the banks. So, is there any link between that? I haven't thought about it. Somebody should.
Besides that, any quick policy prescriptions that you think this budget could advocate as at least short to medium term boosts to the agri and rural sector? Dr. Sen?
See, let's look here. I think this is going to be the last full budget before the election. There will be a lot of talk in the budget on agriculture. Most of the time, talk on agriculture is more than what is actually put down in terms of money. I hope this time you do continue to do the things you are doing well, and we have mentioned them already, including the expansion on the insurance side, as well as the other things we talked about a little earlier. Don't do knee-jerk things, don't have loan waivers, but be prepared. As always, be prepared for the monsoon to go wrong.
All right, fair enough. Mr. Sivakumar, I know you've already outlined...
It might not happen, I hope it doesn't, but...
Yeah, fair enough. Mr. Sivakumar, I know you've already outlined, I think, some key measures that you think need to finally be given teeth. Is there anything in 20 seconds that you'd like to add to that before we wrap it up here on this discussion?
Yeah, I'll just add one item which we haven't discussed is really on the support to food processing. Okay. That's an important area to reduce wastage as well as add value to agriculture and therefore take the prices up. So I think both in terms of fiscal support as well as some rationalization in GST for certain processed food items will be one important step that government can do that will help in the medium term.
All right, gentlemen, we appreciate you joining us this morning on Bloomberg Quint to talk us through some of the challenges facing India's agrarian and rural economies. We almost always only end up scratching the surface in discussions and conversations like this. But we have a few more days before the budget, and we hope to get deeper into some of these conversations. Thanks very much for tuning into Bloomberg Quint. Up next is the F&O Show.